morning. My thanks to the organizers, to John and to Peter for the opportunity to come here. I just came from the EULAR meeting. It's a large meeting, 16,000 people, and I felt lost, and I came here in a friendly environment, and it makes a big difference. So thank you very much for the invitation. These are the disclosures and the disclaimer that I would like to make this morning. You can see the disclosure. There's not much to disclose, but there is, I would like just to make it clear that my comments should not be perceived as a second guessing, but as a critical and hopefully constructive criticism of our studies in lupus. I talk about the community at large. And also I would like to state right from the beginning, I'm in the same boat, and these comments will reflect a sense of common vision and shared responsibility for better treatments in lupus. What I decided to do in the next 25 minutes is to give you my personal perspective in the lupus trials, and this is a perspective that both from my long-standing career at NIH, close to 17 years, but also I've been back in Europe for the last 10 years, and I have also the European perspective. And I would like to start from the beginning. In Greece, we like history, and we like to divide the history in periods. So I would like to divide this talk in three periods. In the azathioprine cyclophosphamide period, the MMF period, and the biologic period in the lupus nephritis trials. I'll be sharing with you a tale involving trials and centers, investigators, and interesting personalities, but I will not make any comments about the personalities of the people involved, regulators, and the market. I will be touching upon study designs, clinical protocols, especially on patient selection and background therapies and outcome measures and follow-up, drugs and treatment strategies. This cannot be a comprehensive review. I will present to you evolving concepts with emphasis on lupus nephritis trials because I'm more familiar with these trials. And I promise to you, I will not show to you any primary data or very few. And also, you should be aware that other discussants in this meeting will highlight other aspects not covered by this presentation. So at the end of this meeting, you'll hear the perspective, you'll hear the same talk from three different people with a different background, and hopefully you'll be wiser at the end of this. In lupus, we're very proud about our achievements. Investigations in lupus have been leading the rheumatology research until a decade ago when biologics put the inflammatory arthritis in the forefront. Over 80% of lupus, severe lupus, goes into complete response or low-dose maintenance therapy. And the survival, as you can see from this graph, is excellent and becomes better and better. And in the lupus field, we have pioneered novel strategy concepts that we share with our colleagues in the vasculitis, and they include the induction maintenance, combination therapy, sequential therapy, and even we were among the first ones in the lupus that we did the first pharmacoeconomic studies long time ago. Let me give you an overview of the three periods in the lupus, and I'll try to make some points that I will use for my lessons later. During the early cyclophosphamide period from 1970 to 86, there were two main players, the Mayo Clinic and the NIH, and individual investigators such as Bevrahan, who did the first randomized controlled trial with azathioprine. They were exploring steroids versus cytotoxic agents, and the questions they were asking is whether they're useful or not. They were studying efficacy complications, as well as novel ways of administering, especially that applies to cyclophosphamide. Both Bevra's study and Donatios were negative, and they were not able to show any clear difference between when comparing azathioprine with cyclophosphamide, and so were the early NIH studies. But Howard Austin in 1986 combined a variety of studies that were going on at the NIH, and this is one important slide that it's important to revisit it because it has useful lessons for the biologics and the current trials. As you can see here, if you compare a variety of treatment strategies, during the first 5 years, everything is the same. And the treatments, and this is the outcome is end-stage renal disease, and as you can see, the differences start becoming more apparent after the 5th year. Prednisone and azathioprine did not reach a statistically significant difference. It may be a difference, but I believe they did not have the right number of patients, as we'll see later. But from this study here, IV cyclophosphamide emerged as the best treatment with the lowest possible complications, and this pretty much has set up the tone for the subsequent studies. So these are the lessons learned. In the short to medium term, 2 to 5 years, most regimens are equal, including steroids. It's very difficult to show any difference. Difference emerge only after 5 years, and this is only for hard outcomes, that is renal function. And background high-dose steroid therapy may obscure the effect of cytotoxic drugs, especially azathioprine and cyclophosphamide, in the short to medium term. And also, from the NIH studies became apparent the lower dose of steroids and aggressive tapering to avoid infectious complications. This is the middle cyclophosphamide period from 1986 to 2000. Took place at NIH and in Chicago from the Lupus Nephritis Collaborative Studies. And they studied, and there's an important difference here, severe proliferative, not just all proliferative, but they selected severe proliferative lupus nephritis. And these were strategies optimizing and addressing strategic issues in the management of nephritis. Ed Lewis's in the New England Journal of Medicine paper showed that addition of plasmapheresis to a background of steroids and cyclophosphamide does not offer an additional benefit in patients with severe lupus nephritis. And the take-home message, which is still valid today, add-on therapies on a background of high-dose steroids, especially in combination with cyclophosphamide, do not work. It's very difficult to demonstrate any differences. And also that the worse prognosis if the abnormal creatinine and improved outcome, if it improves, early response is associated with better outcomes. I was involved with the NIH Lupus study that was published in the Lancet. This is, again, we selected very severe lupus nephritis patients, and there are 2 points that I would like to make here. First, that we did see difference between IV cyclophosphamide with methylprednisolone. Cyclophosphamide did better. But I would like to make the first point here. 40% of the patients that received only methylprednisolone with very severe lupus nephritis, they did well. And when we did, Gaborelli did a 15-year follow-up, they were doing well. So even in severe lupus nephritis, we may be over-treating a certain number of patients. And somebody could take this point and make a point that not everybody needs cyclophosphamide, but it's very difficult to know from the beginning who's likely to respond. So that's an important point. The other, probably the most important point, is that this study set up for the first time settled the issue whether you need maintenance therapy. If you do give a short course of cyclophosphamide and you don't give a maintenance course, you have more relapses. And from now on, all the lupus nephritis studies and the vasculitis, they are divided to the induction phase and the maintenance of remission phase, and this has been an important concept in lupus clinical trials. And just to make sure that we understand what is severe lupus nephritis, there are histological features of fibrinoid necrosis and crescents, or high chronicity, along with abnormal serum creatinine. That's how we selected, both Ed Lewis and us, the patients for these trials. And let me finish with the late cyclophosphamide period from 1986 to 2006. It was done by NIH, but also by the European group, by Frederick Houssiot. And important to note that there were involved patients with proliferative lupus nephritis, but mild to moderate. very few patients were with severe disease, and that's important to keep that in mind. In NIH, we tried to combine IV cyclophosphamide with IV methylprednisolone, and to make a long story short, we needed, Gabor really had to do a follow-up at 12 years to be able to demonstrate clinically significant results. So again, the lesson is that on a background of cyclophosphamide therapy, it's very difficult to demonstrate, an added benefit, and important to keep it in mind. And we used for that, for the first time, a composite response index. Another important issue is that the remission or complete response took a lot of time. The mean was 18 months, and the rates of remission were low, 30% for prednisolone versus 70% the combo at 5 years. There were low rates of remission for methylprednisolone. And also became clear from this study and a follow-up study of 150 lupus patients that Gabor did, that renal flares are an important component of lupus nephritis after aggressive therapy. Within 5 years, 1 in 3 patients will flare. 20% are severe lupus flares, and that may be an important outcome. The Europeans had their important contribution in this period. Frederick showed that it's not for the European patients with mild to moderate disease. It is not, you may use lower doses of cyclophosphamide, half or 1/3 of the NIH regimen. He also showed that if you use sequential therapy, if you use azathioprine to maintain the remission, that works and has been a very useful treatment paradigm. And this is, he introduced the sequential therapy. And also another important contribution from Frederick Hussio's work is that responses at 6 months, they predict a favorable, that is remission or complete responses, they have a predict a favorable outcome even 10 years later. These are the conclusions for the Cytoxan era. Is the drug of choice for lupus nephritis, especially for moderate to severe. Lower doses in non-severe cases may be okay. Amenorrhea was a significant problem. There were complaints during that period for a bias towards cyclophosphamide and regarding the applicability for patients with milder nephritis, especially pediatric lupus. And there were two parties, where the people who were saying always Cytoxan, you have to use Cytoxan, and the Canadians and some of the Canadians, I have to say, and a lot of the pediatric rheumatologists say you never have to use cyclophosphamide. There was no middle ground between them. And they were fighting with each other. And then a new kid appeared on the block, and that was MMF, and we sort of, these fights ceased to exist. But it was discouraging and disheartening to see that the two polarized views. NIH never said that you have always to use cyclophosphamide, and at the same time, the comments that azathioprine, cyclophosphamide should never be used, they're ill-founded. But that's an important lesson from that period, and it's important to avoid it for the future. The MMF era in 1999 to 2010, in transplantation, there were early successes showing that MMF is better than azathioprine to certain aspects. And the hypothesis was put forward that this drug may have comparable efficacy to cyclophosphamide with lower toxicity, and the assumption was made that may be better than azathioprine. So investigators thought that could be a potentially useful drug for milder disease or disease refractory to cyclophosphamide or unable to use cyclophosphamide. And the early studies from China and from Ellen Gisler and from Contreras in Florida studied MMF as induction and maintenance in patients with a mixture of lupus nephritis. Those patients were not necessarily selected for severe disease. So another important take-home message. MMF has not a track record of efficacy in patients selected for severe disease as defined previously. They did see less side effects, especially amenorrhea. Although these were non-inferiority trials, they made the claims that this is superior to cyclophosphamide. And also they made the claim, although it was not founded by the Conrera study, that MMF may be better than azathioprine as a maintenance therapy. And they proclaimed formally and officially the end of the cyclophosphamide era. And I was visiting places, and I was finding out that people were very eager to take this message on. By then I was back in Europe, and I was a little bit more distant from all this polarization. And we decided with European colleagues to take a closer look at the data and do in a critical way to try to see how we can best reconcile these views. These are the guidelines for the management of lupus, and I have in these slides the European lupus guidelines. As you can see here, we state clearly that immunosuppressive drugs are better than if you add immunosuppressives to steroids. But also we said that MMF is good, but the data extend only to the medium term. By medium term, we defined up to 5 years. We felt that we needed data up to 10 years, and it would be better for everybody. And also we felt that because of these uncertainties, if the patient doesn't respond to MMF within the first 6 months, they should be switched to cyclophosphamide. We also recognized the importance of the flares. And because management guidelines are not easy to read, and responding to an invitation by Peter Lipsky, we sort of developed algorithms and tried to interpret this for the managing clinician. And this is one of the algorithms that we have published in the Nature Rheumatology and have updated more recently. And finally, we entered the biological era, which starts from 1997. And I guess continues up to now. There was an increased interest during this period from the industry to develop biologics and other novel therapeutics for lupus. Meanwhile, there were important efforts to define the domains that we need to assess in clinical trials in lupus: the activity, damage, quality of life, physician-patient global assessment. At the same time, the FDA became apparent of the need, and they published the 2005 guidance. And they said that we're willing to accept claims for increased effectiveness, but less on increased safety. And you can see here some of the guidelines. But this is an important point I would like to make. This was a very useful document and reflected the consensus of the community, although it took several years to develop. And they felt strongly at the FDA that the BILAG, they felt that they favored the BILAG for its ability to document worsening of disease. Mandatory exclusion. They told us that you cannot just decrease disease activity, but you also have to show that the disease in other parts of the other system does not worsen. And the industry took this away and felt like this was an endorsement of the BILAG. And they ran away with that. And this is where we stand after 10 years of these investigations. In contrast to initial claims, MMF was not found to be superior to cyclophosphamide as induction therapy. Jerry Appel has published that in the JSON. One study suggests that also it's not superior to azathioprine as maintenance in vasculitis. And also, Frederick Husseau has a study that's in press suggesting that for maintenance therapy, azathioprine is equivalent to MMF. So all these claims about the wonderful things that MMF does, there were some doubts. There are more recently. There is a study, there is a press release suggesting that it's superior to MMF to azathioprine for maintenance, but I have to see the data. I have no access. Meanwhile, in the biologics era, drugs known to be effective in RA and vasculitis, such as the rituximab, show no difference over placebo for general lupus or lupus nephritis. Another B-cell-directed therapy has been reported to demonstrate efficacy. I have not seen the primary data. The abatacept for general lupus showed no difference. Trials in lupus nephritis as an add-on therapy to MMF completed, but they're not published yet. And there is another study headed by David Gufsi that in combination with cyclophosphamide, which I understand is in progress. And also, we had our first success, the Milibumab, which is efficacious in decreasing disease activity, preventing flares, as an add-on therapy for moderate to severe lupus nephritis, albeit with a small treatment effect. These are the data that we heard from Jill Byron last night. So what are the issues and what are we facing currently with some of these results? Why so many difficulties in trials with lupus? Why conflicting results? Every field had its own difficulties, but somehow the feeling is that in lupus we had more difficulties. Do we still maintain credibility in view of the contradictory results or the misadventures of the recent randomized controlled trials? Is there a curse in the lupus nephritis trials? Or, just to remember the ancient Greeks, is there a hybris? Did we overstretch our abilities? Or they were made claims that they were not supported by data? Importantly, have we learned any lessons, and what are they? What can we do about them? And is there a future in the lupus studies? Is the glass half full or half empty? Of course, the glass is half full, and therefore I'm not going to discuss that. There is a bright future for lupus nephritis, so I will not get into that. Lessons learned. First, demonstrating efficacy on a background therapy of high-dose steroids or other immunosuppressive therapies, that is the add-ons design, is hard, especially in the short and medium term. And I think you should avoid it unless there are data for synergism or additive effects from previous studies. For example, David Wolfsy have shown that abatacept with cyclophosphamide in mice may have a synergistic effect. In that case, may some sense. We learned this lesson from these trials. The problem is, of course, is that slows patients recruitment versus risking a negative study. And the solution that at least I will offer is to use the lowest possible amount of background therapy for short-term phase 2-3 studies with a limited number of centers recognized for their expertise in lupus. It is safe, especially in nephritis, if you have the right exit criteria, and we have done that very nicely in this anti-CD40 trial that was published in Arthritis and Rheumatism almost 10 years ago. This is, and just to be practical, let's take the Explorer study. This is the original design of the study. And this is the general study. They took patients with moderate lupus bilag and mostly skin and joint. And there are several questions about this study. Is this the best indication designed for a drug expected to have a measured treatment effects shown in non-randomized controlled trials? Is there enough room for the drug to show what it can do? Is this a design for induction or as a maintenance or for both? They did not see any outcomes. And let's come to the nephritis part, which I think is probably more important. In the LUNAR study, they studied patients with focal and proliferative lupus nephritis, which failed to respond to MMF and steroids, and they did that, the rituximab. Somebody will, I'm second guessing, but may have done something else. Since these patients did not respond to MMF, somebody could stop the MMF and compare IV cyclophosphamide versus rituximab, or azathioprine versus rituximab with moderate dose of steroids, with trying to taper and get completely off steroids by 6 months and have exit criteria if the patient gets worse. And because that would have been an important design to see whether complete remission of steroids is an achievable goal with this regimen, similar to what they did with the RAVE study that John Stone presented at the ACR in the vasculitis. And as you can show that they show that cyclophosphamide is equivalent to rituximab, but it was better for the relapsing disease, and also they were able to show that you can achieve remission status of steroids. The second lesson is clinical meaningful results in orphan disease status. I think it's important for the community to push the lupus orphan drug, for the orphan drug status for lupus nephritis trials. It's not this is the definition, and I think we can push the FDA or the EMA in Europe to achieve the same status, because that will allow strategies to improve a little bit the design and adapt the studies. And I think I have in this outline, I have some of the arguments that somebody could use. At the same time, because there are not enough patients, we need better and adaptive trial designs with less patients, and it's important this is a future project of the EULAR Task Force on Lupus. The composite endpoints, the responder indexes was, the success of belimumab teaches that it's important to have these composite endpoints, but responding to Richard Ferris's trial, and this very nice overview, critical overview in the arthritis care research, it may be better for drugs with a lot of efficacy to have to raise the threshold to 7 or to 11 or 12, similar to what we do with SCR20 and SCR50 or 20. Trial designs and drugs, it's important to know and respect the strength limitations of your design, your protocol, and your drugs, because as we saw with the lupus nephritis studies in MMF, there are a lot of things that the limitations that they were existing, that they were ignored by the investigators, and that led to erroneous conclusions which were not confirmed by the larger study. And it's important also to keep in mind that the short term long term is better than the short term. And it's important not to declare a victory of the war if you win the first battle, and it's important not to underestimate your opponent, especially if the long-term data exists. And why is one therapy over the other? There may be room for more than 1 or 2 or 3 therapies in lupus nephritis, and it's important to individualize choices in lupus. And let me finish with a final point. What I have found interesting during the last 10 years is that azathioprine is a drug that was neglected and emerges as the Cinderella in the treatment of lupus nephritis. There are data suggesting that it's efficacious for mild to moderate cases, and also is very good for maintenance. And that's something, at least I made a mistake of ignoring this, and I have to share this with you. But maybe a drug that probably we should be using more. And I understand that there is not time. I have to finish here. But let me finish by adding this comment. For all the trials in lupus nephritis, it's important to have long-term data. I'm still waiting to see the 10-year data with MMF. Otherwise, I'm at loss. And the only drug that we have long data is the cyclophosphamide from the NIH protocol or the Europeans. And my question for the community is, should the government pay for the long-term follow-up if the industry does not pay? I think it's important. Otherwise, you cannot evaluate a drug like MMF or the biologics. For the biologics, of course, they are obligated to create the registries. But this is something that I would like to leave an issue for you this morning. So I think there is a bright future for lupus nephritis trials. I think there was a hubris initially, but I think everybody has learned their lessons, and I think we have better designs and better drugs, and I'm sure during the next decade we'll have much better things to look for. Thank you very much.
I'm sure there are a number of questions for this provocative talk. Yes.
Hi, Christy Sandborg from Stanford. I just wanted to briefly comment on how refreshing this is to look at the history. I think it's very helpful to all of us. And I do want to slightly correct one statement you made about pediatric rheumatologists and avoiding Cytoxan. We actually just recently did a survey, and 80% of pediatric rheumatologists prefer Cytoxan for at least class 4 lupus nephritis. So I think that we have often been in pediatric rheumatology community in the United States, a big supporter of cyclophosphamide for all the reasons that you stated about really long-term effects.
Thank you very much.
Joan?
Dimitri, you know, I think that when we have struggled mightily for such a long time with designing these trials, to call it hubris was kind of upsetting to me, because we were doing the best we could and we failed, and we're learning from it. And I would just like to say, I think most of us are quite humble about it, and we're never arrogant in the first place. This is an immense problem.
Thank you. The hubris applies to the MMF and to myself too. Okay, and I made it clear. I neglected the data. Azathioprine, for example, I was not as critical as I should have been. So therefore, and again, we're in the same boat.
To think that we could predict in advance, exactly how it would pan out when we start to apply some of these instruments. And the other point that I want to make is that when people say the instruments have failed, I think that's a failure to recognize that it was trial design that failed. For example, in the Explorer trial, which failed to meet any of its primary or secondary outcomes, the BILAG very clearly showed beautiful improvement in the placebo group and in the treatment group. The BILAG worked fine, but by selecting from the BILAG endpoints that were not going to work, it actually went the opposite way. Instead of having everyone improving, which is what happened on all those steroids, what ended up happening was picking those endpoints, everybody looked like they failed. We had 70% failure in both groups. So I think rather than damning the instruments, we need to really take a very careful look at how we select from them and put them together. And our first successful clinical trials did exactly that. They took the SLEDAI, which has flaws, they took the BILAG, which has flaws, and they designed the trial to the strengths of the SLEDAI and to the strengths of the BILAG, where the SLEDAI might let you down. And they finally ended up with an endpoint that worked. So I think we're okay. We've got instruments that are as good as it gets, and we just need to be a little patient and not have the hubris to blame ourselves for our arrogance. We're just, we're all arrogant people, but we're also very humble. And so we must forgive ourselves.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anne, I think that requires no answer. Anne?
Anne Davidson from New York. I have two questions about the NIH Cytoxan trial. I've shown that graph to fellows for many years, and that's how we decide to use Cytoxan oftentimes. But when you really think about it, it was only 72 patients. You didn't tell us anything about the ethnicity of those patients, and I assume that the ones that came to the NIH may be a different kind of subgroup than what we see in urban populations. And also, when you give Cytoxan, you're pretty sure that the patient is being compliant, whereas when you give anything orally, there is a relatively good chance, and in some cases a very good chance, that the patient is not being compliant with all the medications. And so how do you kind of try and sort that out and tell us that this one trial of 72 people is what's going to, and it's the best we've got, obviously, in terms of long-term outcomes, but are we really satisfied with that? And how would you go forward in terms of trying to deal with 10-year outcomes with compliance issues?
3 short points, very valid observations. I made it clear, not Cytoxan for everybody. I think it was overstated, NIH we never said that. We said it's just better, number one. Number two, certainly there were flaws, important flaws with the NIH study, but it's the best data that we had back then. And Frederick Hussio's study, which was done later, confirmed the importance that cyclophosphamide is a useful drug in the management of lupus nephritis. And the issue, of course, the lupus nephritis, I think they are very valid points. It's not only, it's the compliance, the socioeconomic status, it's where you are, the race and ethnicity, but overall, there is a feeling in the community, and if you survey 100 rheumatologists, 80% they will tell you that if I'm into trouble with a difficult lupus patient, I'll use cyclophosphamide, because they've used it and they have experience in their hands. But these are all valid observations.
Quick question?
Yeah, 2 minor points. One, that there is no difference, as you know, Dimitrios, excellent talk, but there is no difference in the serum creatinine in the NIH study and the pediatric study and any other studies. You just called it severe. The creatinine is almost identical. So I just want to correct that. Number two, the pediatric study never claimed there was no use for Cytoxan. It was just suggested it should not be considered a drug of choice. But my real question is, knowing the long-term outcome, knowing the long-term efficacy of steroids, and knowing that 5 to 10-year outcome is what we care about, how comfortable are you really in tapering steroids at 6 months? So, I mean, it was very interesting because you know how they work.
Thank you. When we have done the long-term studies, we have seen a lot of toxicity that has published, a lot of vascular necrosis. 1 in 5 of our patients had a vascular necrosis. An equal number, they had cataracts. So there is significant morbidity associated with steroids, and you know that better. So I think, I think it's a challenge. Similar to rheumatoid arthritis, I think we have, that's a goal in my mind, to develop steroid-free regimens. Long-term steroid use may not be as safe as we may, but I guess that's a personal opinion.
Thank you. Peter, last comment, quick question.
Sure, Boston. I'd like to echo Dimitrios' excellent review in that if you take a look at history, we're doing a heck of a lot better than we were in the 1950s. Whatever drugs we're using, back then, most patients did die of lupus nephritis, and most do not now. This is an area in flux. It's in evolution, and we keep on getting better. One question. I'd like to see if you have any comments about one of the other investigators at the NIH, Fred Steinberg, who made the point that he thought that the most important way of treating lupus nephritis was controlling the blood pressure.
Well, this is a wise advice and was given when people did not appreciate that as much, and is as important as anything else. Thank you.
Thank you.